Hello, everyone, and welcome to Loud Poets Happy Hour. I am Dr. Katie Ailes. I am your host with the most for Happy Hour. This is our brand new series in which we take on writing challenges, complete them, offer some tips, some guidance for how to do it, and chat about all of it, and invite you guys to join us for the journey. This particular segment is our Loud Poets Happy Hour check-in, in which I check in with one of the people writing for this week's challenge and see how they're getting on, and either offer them some guidance, some support in their writing process, or give them a swift kick up the tush to actually get started on writing their poem. If you haven't seen the other videos in Happy Hour, you can check them out through the playlist up in the eye. We have full episodes in which we share the poetry that we're working on. We have 5 top tips videos in which I offer some tips and some examples for the challenges that we're taking on. So there is a lot of goodness there. And if you're enjoying this series, please do consider giving us a like and subscribing to the channel. It really means a huge amount and helps us to continue doing all of this work. So what is the challenge that we're working on this week? I hear you ask through the internet. Our challenge this week is remixing cliches. So this was proposed by Kevin McLean. You can watch the full episode where he proposed this challenge up through the link in the eye. And I think this is such a fun challenge because you're taking on sort of a poetry trope and you're somehow converting it into something different. You're revamping it, sticking it in a blender and seeing what comes out. So I'm so excited for this challenge. And here to chat with me about how he's getting on with this challenge and hopefully share some interesting experiences with the writing process is the fantastic, the strong, the excellent Mr. Mark Gallie. Mark, how are you doing this week?
Oh, I'm a bit broken after the intro. I'm doing all right. Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
You are very, very welcome. How are you getting on with this challenge? Have
I'm
you
not happy to be doing it at all.
cliches?
No,
No.
man, I'm not happy to be doing it at all. Okay, it's a bad challenge.
It's a bad challenge.
And I blame Kev. It's cliches by that they're overdone. They're overdone.
They are
I
overdone.
really thought the people would go to myth, which has been definitely not overdone in history ever at any point whatsoever.
No myths have become cliches, Mark.
No, absolutely not whatsoever. I have a feeling Kev's going to get me by doing both now, just to upset me. But yeah, I'm doing all right. I'm doing all right with cliche. Starting it was probably the hardest part, figuring out what to write about.
Yeah. So have you picked your cliche?
I have. Oh, at this point, so close to the deadline, I would have hoped so. I have. It took a wee while because the cliche obviously is that one of those beautiful things where it's quite broad, but again, the trapping of cliche, or it feels like the trapping is because it's all so overdone. You don't want to pick any of them.
Yeah.
And then on the other, so if you're picking like generic cliches, you're like, well, a lot of people do them, so I don't want to do them. And then on the other side, picking cliches about poetry or in poems I've seen, I don't want the people that have done certain cliches I might be taking the mick out of or pulling attention to be taking any offense. Again, I'm guilty of most of the cliches I'd gone through, so it's a hard juggling act. But I did settle on one. So I have settled on, and I have been writing towards, I have not yet finished, but I'm writing towards, I realized that an awful lot of poetry was a bit like cartoons, was a bit like cartoons that go on long enough, is eventually a cartoon will do an episode about animation or about cartoons. And I noticed that eventually you give a poet enough time or enough writer's block, they eventually will start writing about poetry and then blaming poetry normally for something. So that's my cliches. More not necessarily, but like I suppose poems to poetry, if that makes is that the term? This the thing, if it makes sense.
Yeah. That is such a good. That's not even something that I thought about when I was making the 5 tips video, but that's absolutely brilliant. Yeah, poems to poetry. Do you know the term ars poetica? The
I do, of course I do, as a professional.
naturally.
But I mean, it's not just us two. It's not just us here,
No,
Katie. So maybe
naturally.
maybe for the folks at home,
Mm. So ars poetica means the art of poetry, right? And so that's what you're describing, right?
of
There
course.
there is sort of a a genre for these poems, which are poems about poetry, sort of meditations on the craft itself, ars poetica. And yeah, there's so many different ways of tackling it. Oh, I'm so glad that you brought this up, Mark, because this is such a great genre. So yeah, how have you tackled it? Like, is this something that you've noticed that you've been drawn to in your own work, is writing about poetry, or is this sort of the first time that you've taken
Um,
this on?
it did take me quite a long time to get to this. Like I was saying before, I was starting and figuring out what I was going to do was the hardest part of going through things. And so I did a bit what you suggested. I kind of looked a bit internal of like things. If I was like, if I'm going to write about a cliche and I'm typically going to default to being like annoyed or angry about that, then I kind of want it to be directed at something I've maybe done. So I sort of looked at things that either I do a lot or I avoid.
Yeah.
And admittedly, this one doesn't really come into the two, but I know when I wrote Don't Trust Poets, it was kind of around that idea of the, of that. But then I was thinking about that. I'm going that, the ars about ars poetica, um, an argument that if it's become a genre, then it is, a cliche in and of itself. If it's its own genre, if it's overdone enough to have a genre, or overdone enough to have a genre, I shouldn't keep saying overdone. Um,
But
but
but I think sorry, just to
no, no.
note on that, I think it's so interesting when we talk about cliche, and I've been thinking so much through this challenge about like what's the point between like creating a genre for something and then considering that to be a cliche, right? Like just because we have a name for it, arguably you could be like, oh, so many poets write about poetry, what a hackneyed overdone thing. But you're also like, no, but there's value in it, like, and that also means that there's value in remixing it and tearing it apart. So yeah,
Oh
anyway, yeah.
yeah. Oh yeah. There's loads to be done with remixing with it, and that's sort of part of the, I suppose, the fun of this challenge is you get to not only is you got to pick a cliche, but then you got to pick what you do with it.
Yeah.
And so for me, maybe not, I realize it's not unhelped by all the things I have said so far. I've got sort of the reputation as more of the grumpier, angry, it was the threatening poet, as I've been called. So I thought,
Surely not, Mark.
oh, a lot of the poems I have seen to poetry, or a lot of the poetry to poetry, is normally blaming poetry. It's normally poetry's fault. And a lot of the times, I don't think it ever is poetry's fault. And I'm like, you know what? It's about time someone went to poetry and went, no, no, I'm not here to hurt you. It's okay. Thank you. I'm sorry about them. Excuse my friend. They're very upset.
I feel
So
like that's the best smackdown I've ever heard on like Marianne Moore. I don't know if there's a famous line from her poem Poetry. It just starts so the title is Poetry and the first line is, I too dislike it. There are things that are important beyond all this fiddle.
I couldn't remember the exact quote, but I'm like, it's basically like, I too hate that. I was like, I couldn't remember what it was. It's
Like,
not. It's obviously not meant to mess with anyone. The point of me doing this is, one, because I was made to by you folks. This is your fault. And two, it's supposed to be a bit of fun. If anyone, if the final product, if it's any good, if there's any parallels to anyone's poems, I promise you, in the nicest way possible, I wasn't even thinking about you. So, but yeah, so that's kind of where I'm going to go with that. It's not quite there yet. It's difficult trying to then, when just like after the execution of going, right, I've got the idea and I know what I want to do, but then going, right, what do I do with it?
mm,
Because it's obviously like going, so I want to really upset people, so I'm adding in as many cliches as I possibly can, i.e., cliched phrases and terminology, just to, because I'm a mental person like that.
oh, so you're really like up in the ante. So you're not only taking the form of
Mhm.
sort of an arguably cliched form of poetry about poetry, but you're also adding in cliched phrases into your poem about poetry.
My feeling is if I add enough of the use of the term cliche and enough things that could be considered subversion, even if the poetry is rubbish, people will be like, I see. They'll take enough time to think about it so that I can escape.
That might be either the most genius or the worst creative approach to poetry I've ever heard. And I mean that as a compliment.
Oh, thank you. And I mean,
Yeah.
ultimately, it will depend on the execution of said poem. If it is just all manner of rubbish, but then I think I'd like that if I left and the whole crowd was just going, just in pain from sheer cliche overload. But then
It's
that's
a
probably a bad
strategy.
poem if they don't get past the first line, right? They're still stuck in that. That's probably not a great example of a good poem.
I suppose so. Here's my question for you, Mark,
Mm-hmm.
as I'm thinking through this. So you've got these two layers. You've got like the form of the poem about poetry, and then you're stuffing it chock full of these cliched phrases. How are sort of the cliched phrases tied into the commentary that you're making about poetry? Because I'm like, this is so meta. Like, is the poem meant to be saying poetry is full of cliches, but it still has value anyway? Or is it like,
Be a good question. It's the hard. That's my hardest bit with this. Is kind of
mm,
going because I've got the things that I want to do. I have the pieces of the jigsaw, but I don't know what the jigsaw's about. And I'm in that weird bit where I've got quite a lot of stuff and lots of sort of different tangents, and I'm trying to marry them all together. I don't know how well it's working. But there you go. You're asking how am I using it? With poetry, there's always been more to you than meets the eye, but beauty is in the eye of the beholder, etc., etc., etc. So it's the so
right.
like they're I'm not the one is not to chuck them in just to have a lot of them. The one is that they will still make sense within the thing. Um because I'm aware that I'm trying to just smush a bunch of stuff together, throw all the food in the fridge together and call it leftover casserole. Um
But again, not a bad strategy. I think I suppose my thought at this point, because I'm like, this sounds so interesting and so meta and just but that's what's so valuable, I think. And one of the reasons why ars poetica, I think, arguably, yes, are overdone, but I think one thing that can be really fascinating about them is really interrogating your own craft as a writer, and also interrogating this genre and thinking, okay, you are, yeah, plagued by cliches and overused phrases and forms and all of these other things that sort of make people go, oh, poetry, love is like a red rose, boring. But what's at the heart of that? What value can you find in that language? And so I think,
we'll
it's
find out.
interesting because you've sort of taken on the harder thing. It would be very easy to just write a cliche written ars poetica and be like, poetry, you're old and full of crud and boring, meh. But you're making a love letter, which I think is much
Well, no,
better.
I'm not making it necessarily a love
Oh
letter
no.
because that was nearly my cliche was just love poetry in general, which is
Oh
the
god.
most cliche thing in poetry, in my personal opinion. The
I would
biggest
agree.
cliche is love poetry in general, and it's not a bad thing. Say like cliches are not bad. They're it's you know they become what they set out to be. They're overdone because they're popular, and so a lot of people want to write about them, or they explore a
Yeah,
lot of different themes. They're only cliche or stereotype once they have been done so often that people have heard them a lot. But the benefit of that
exactly.
is a lot of people have still heard of them, even if they don't know what it's from.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the hope with this. It's not necessarily to get people with the poetry, but to trick them with cliches. And then they were like, that was a poem, apparently. It's the long game. We'll see. We'll see on the episode how well it works out.
It's my favorite form of poetry, though, is poetry which tricks people into liking poetry. And I don't know if there's a word for that. I think it's just good poetry. But
Maybe you
mm,
would be the person I would assume that would know if there
well,
was such a word.
if there was such a word, well, viewers, come up with the word for that. Language is fungible. So, and Mark, thank you for, yeah, sharing a little bit of your writing
Hmm.
journey here. I'm very curious to see how this turns out because this sounds fascinating, and I know you're salty at Kev for this challenge, but I'm so glad that we have this challenge as our first one, because I think starting a new project all about, poetry writing challenges with a challenge about poetic cliches and interrogating the form of poetry is very meta, but also
Yeah,
fascinating. So
I
I'm
love
very
it.
much
Yeah.
enjoying this one.
No, thank you for having me. Thanks for checking in. It was even getting just getting to talk it through with someone is quite helpful. I don't like to subject all the people near me to like the early ideas. So
Oh
thank you.
no. No, very, very dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
Living with a poet, very,
Oh
very
yeah,
dangerous.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yep, yep.
we'd advise against it as people who live with poets. So thank you guys so much for joining us for this very first Loud Poets Happy Hour check-in. I hope that you enjoyed it and maybe hopefully got some tips that will help you with your own writing. If you are joining us on this challenge, I hope that your writing is going fantastically well. We would absolutely love it if you shared your work with us, either putting it into the comments of the YouTube video, sharing it with us on social media. All of the links are down below in the video description. We love reading poetry. We heckin' love poetry, guys. So please do share what you're working on with us. If you're enjoying the series, we would also love if you considered supporting us on our Patreon channel. That is how we are supporting this and also currently doing a big push towards accessibility on our YouTube channel and specifically doing more closed captioning. So if you could chuck us a quid a month through the Patreon, that would mean the world and would also mean for you that you would get to submit challenges into our Poetic Pint Glass of Poetic Challenges, which would be pretty awesome. And then you would also get plenty of tips and guidance from us on how to complete those challenges, which is also pretty dope. So yeah, your support means the world. We very much hope that you are enjoying this. And please do come back on Sunday, June 6th for the full episode all about this challenge where you will get to hear Mark's completed poem. Very
Yes, they
exciting.
will. Yes, they
It
will.
will exist, which is pretty cool,
I-
as well as the poems from the other poets who are undertaking this challenge. So thank you again, guys. Hope you enjoyed it, and we will see you next time. Mark, say cheers.
Cheers.